All right, so welcome to the next lecture set. This is the lecture on ideology criticism, which covers the last couple weeks of reading, but heavily focuses on the cloud reading and particular parts of the cloud reading that I'm going to pull out in order to help you complete your mini ideology criticism. That's your second journal. So this is going to focus on helping you understand what ideology criticism is as a method, as one of those methods of rhetorical criticism that we talked about in the first unit, but also help you understand how to do your second journal. So in in this article, Rhetorical Criticism for Underdogs, Dana Cloud argues that she believes that criticism, or in her case, rhetorical criticism, because she really is a rhetorical critic by trade, should take the side of the oppressed and the exploited whose lives are in part dictated by the powerful. And so one way that rhetorical critics can help take the side of the oppressed and sort of fight for the underdog is by understanding like the role of rhetoric in shaping that power, in creating that relationship where certain lives are dictated by the powerful. What is the role of rhetoric? How does rhetoric serve those in power? So rhetorical critics can contribute to the project of social activism by discovering and explaining how power operates in discourse. So this means like that rhetorical criticism of this nature is interdisciplinary because it doesn't just look at rhetoric in a vacuum, like what was good about the rhetoric, what was persuasive about the rhetoric, but it looks deeper as to what the motivations behind the persuasiveness of the rhetoric is. Like, why is the rhetoric being used, and to for what purposes is the rhetoric being used in light of particular power dynamics? So, as an ideology critic, you could be looking at various systems of power, which we'll go over. But I wanted to cover really quick Dana Cloud, who is as I mentioned, a prominent member of the field of rhetorical criticism, like a very well published scholar in rhetorical criticism, but also, as her Twitter profile shows, considers herself a socialist, LGBTQ activist, anti-racist for women's liberation and workers' power, and professor of communication studies, parent and partner. So professor of communication studies and rhetorical critic is just one of the hats that she sort of wears, and also forefronts her socialism, social activism, and through her socialism, her queer activism, her anti-racist and women's activism, and labor activism, all a lot of that activism is enacted through her scholarship. So in the 4 to 6 step method, when Foss says that step 6 um, is to take your rhetorical criticism and apply it to social activism. I think that Dana Cloud and other scholars who are ideology critics would disagree that that was necessarily like a separate step that you had to take after you're writing your paper, because writing a paper and bringing awareness to a specific mode of power and the way that it's operating in rhetoric could be considered activism in and of itself. Like, I don't know if you all have ever heard of, for example, Michel Foucault, who wrote The History of Sexuality, but it was a book that defined the dominant discourses of heteronormativity and the dominant discourses of the nuclear family, and the way that those served to create a system of homophobia which oppressed queer, gay, and lesbian bodies. And that Foucault and The History of Sexuality are both like at least commonly cited and referred to enough in our culture that a good amount of you have probably heard of it, and it's had a trickle down like effect in academia in terms of understanding even concepts such as heteronormativity. And another scholar, Edward Said, who was a Foucauldian theorist in a literary department, deconstructed the field knowledge of Orientalism, and that book itself sort of changed what we think of Orientalism as. So we don't think of it necessarily as neutral, but as ideological. So his work proved that Orientalism was not just a neutral study of the Orient, it was an ideology which constructed the idea of the Orient. And so, um, ideology criticism is basically a critique of ideological rhetoric, which is why Cloud says it's not ideological criticism, it's ideology criticism, because the rhetoric itself, the text that you are analyzing is ideological, and that's what you're looking at, is what is the ideology behind the text. So essentially, rhetoric, like ideology critique, looks at and uncovers the relationship between rhetoric and power. So another quote from the Cloud essay is that ideologies exist, like they're out there, and critics must analyze them in order to understand the discourses that uphold power. So discourse is a not just like something that one person said. Discourse is a combination of language and power. It's like the rhetoric that circulates within systems of power. So power in this sense could be is the capacity to exert control, whether that be like governmental control, like control over a state, control over like a corporation. Like if you're Jeff Bezos, obviously you have a lot of money. Like people say, Dan Gilbert has just as much power as Duggan in our city. And then you could also think of power as the capacity to exert control in culture. So, for example, like Cardi B or the Kardashians, or the capacity to exert control over your own future. So, if you have limited power, your power is also limited sometimes in terms of your own future. So, for example, money being a symbol of power, the lack of money, it means the lack of ability to control your own future. And the public good also, like people who are oppressed don't have as much say in what happens with the overall public good as people who have power. And then, or you could think of power as the capacity to, to control others. So it could either be like the power harnessed by people, or and exercised by people, or power to control one's own destiny. But essentially, power, it for a lot of you, it doesn't have to be explained what power is, but it's intuitive. Power is the ability to, exercise, make choices and execute those choices. So with rhetoric and power, language and power, it's a cycle, which is why with this image over here, I've made it so that it wasn't just two images, it was the four images: rhetoric, power, to show how it has a cyclical building effect. So like let's say um the power of school, the power of your school, right, to dictate rules. And they have rhetoric which determines like norms about what's acceptable to do at school and what's not acceptable to do. And then that rhetoric, it helps build their sense of power, right? So the rhetoric that schools use, sometimes it's in the interest of the students, but sometimes it's just in the interest of preserving power. So the power creates the authority to produce rhetoric, and then the rhetoric creates the legitimacy to continue to exercise that authority. So it continues to build upon itself. Like the more power you have, the more means you have to control rhetoric or disseminate rhetoric. And then that rhetoric can end up strengthening your power, which ends up strengthening your ability to, you know, control the rhetoric more. So it's not a cycle that can't be broken, because we'll talk about how power can go both ways, power and resistance. But it is important to know that it's not a one-way relationship where rhetoric completely shapes power or power completely shapes rhetoric. They have a mutually constituting or mutually influencing relationship on each other. So you might have heard the cliche or the sort of proverb language shapes reality before, especially as communication majors. It's important to think about how power is not just like the United States federal government, for example. It's not just a power that's out there that just exists in Washington, D.C., and with the military and the White House and all that. It's also an ideology that exists in writing, in language, and the language and linguistic system, for example, that makes our Constitution possible and makes our Constitution like legible and enforceable through the codes of the language that it not only relies upon but enforces. That makes our nation possible, right? So our nation exists materially, like in reality, but if it weren't for language, we wouldn't have the conception of like the United States of America or the Constitution. So in that way, us thinking of ourselves as one nation or as Americans, or if you come from a different country and don't consider yourself American, whatever country you consider yourself of, that wouldn't be possible to have that sense of nationality if it weren't for the linguistic systems that created the ordering scheme of like the nation state and the citizen that falls underneath the nation state. So there's always an ideology or an ideological justification that legitimizes or creates a justification for a system of power. So the theory is the ideology or the ideological justification. In the context of, like, for example, capitalism, the ideology would be, the free market, and the praxis would be the institution of capitalism through the system of creating, the mint, like creating money, creating banks, that kind of stuff, like creating contracts within that system for implementing the material reality of that system. So each system of power has a praxis and an ideology, which is why rhetorical criticism, this is why we're talking about power in this class, because language has a lot to do with power. It helps, when we say language shapes reality, it's not to say that everything is reducible to language, because of course, when we go to war, for example, you know, there's material consequences of war that can't only be explained by language, like military fighting, and death and stuff like that. That's not necessarily a consequence of just the language, but there were rhetorical justifications which made the war, for example, possible, or which made the buildup of the military in the first place in order to defend or preemptively go in and fight wars. It made that reality a possibility through the use of language. And then systems of power, these are some examples, but this is not a limited or exhausted, but thinking of systems of power just to let you all brainstorm for maybe your second journal article. Systems of power can include like a nation, a specific political party. So, when we were looking at Reagan's speech, like how did Reagan's speech help prepare Americans to accept like the Republican agenda in specific? Or you could look at just like him trying to tie it to his policies to the American legacy overall, or a specific administration, like how did that speech help, like we could say that speech helped his party, but also that it helped his, we could look at ways that that speech potentially helped his administration. And then like major corporations or international organizations like the United Nations. Or you could look at the rhetoric of you could look at the rhetoric of an international organization and the way that the rhetoric upholds like the power of that organization. Or you could look at broader systems like capitalism, or even you could critique socialism, right? So we have power systems that might contradict each other, and you could still, like a rhetorical critic could critique capitalism, or it could critique socialism. And then, patriarchy, similarly, you could say like matriarchy, systems of power include matriarchy. Patriarchy is hegemonic in our system, meaning that like matriarchy isn't the norm, even though it might be the norm in some counterpublics or like some areas that um, are not the majoritarian areas. But patriarchy is more hegemonic, and matriarchy could be more resistive or like a subculture of system of power. And then we have heteronormativity, which is the normalization of the hetero nuclear family, so that one man and one woman should be together and have children and reproduce, or that even if they don't have children and reproduce, it should still just be one man and one woman, because sometimes it's rooted in religion, sometimes it's rooted in science, or pseudoscientific justifications. And then we have like racism, of various forms of racism, but conceptualizing them as systems of power, you could think of like white supremacy as a system, or even whiteness. Another way that critical race theorists would put this is anti-blackness, which is a system that is perpetuated, not just like that hierarchizes whiteness at the top, but also positions blackness as negation to whiteness. It's a more common way of describing anti-black racism, or anti-blackness is a more common way of describing systemic racism in critical race theory of this century. And then we have colonialism or imperialism, or even like neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism is something that you might see. Like, so for example, how you might see a critique of how international organizations foster their rhetoric fosters a or aids in a form of neo-colonialism, whereby the formerly colonized maintain oppressed, and the former colonizers still maintain in a system of hierarchy, even though colonization is technically, like colonialism is technically over, that the relationship still exists. And then some, like you could also think of resistance movements as being systems of power too. So even if systems of power are not hegemonic, like decolonial resistance movements, for example, would be a system of power that was intended to resist colonialism. And those systems of power did rise to prominence, so that a lot of nations received independence. And then social movements such as, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement or the Me Too movement would be the most contemporary examples, could be, considered systems of power that are fighting against the more hegemonic dominant discourses. Or you could even think of systems of power not even necessarily as governmental, as I was saying, but as like the academy, for example, which is a way of people talking about like universities as a whole. Or you could look at an individual university, or even a department within the university. Like departments have institutional power. For example, I'm sure you've all experienced like to determine what classes you have to take if you want to be disciplined in our field. That's determined by the department. Religious institutions are systems of power. Families are systems of power. The prison industrial complex, for example, is a system of power that is multifaceted in terms of it's partially state, partially non-state. And then just a variety of grassroots organizations, like even organizations that are, based around ending prisons, or organizations that have been based around setting up community centers, or I mean, we see with grassroots organizations, we even have like on the one side we have Black Lives Matter, and on the other side we have Proud Boys right now, which is like the white nationalist organizing party in who go protest against Black Lives Matter protesters in our nation. So basically, what this shows is that systems of power are not inherently negative or inherently positive. Like power could be used for good or could be used for bad. And oftentimes, power, when it ends up, people are easily corruptible, as literature shows. A lot of the literature that you all read in high school and stuff, like people are easily corruptible. So power is often exercised for bad, but it's not always exercised for bad. So ideology critique doesn't just have to be like power is always bad. And some systems of power are oppressive and some are more resistive, and then there are some that are it would be hard to pinpoint, and like for example the nation, and to be like, oh, it's always good or it's always bad. Or even like an international organization like the UN, even my example, like the UN does use its power for questionable or negative things, but it also uses its power for positive or affirming things. So what is the difference between negative versus appreciative ideology criticism? Well, in the Cloud article, she doesn't exactly use the words negative and appreciative, but I'm taking the terminology from the last article, the Condon article, and then using that to delineate the distinction she made between some of the types of criticism that can be done. And so with negative criticism, and I have it in the back arrow because it does a critique of how this rhetoric is regressive. It's not good for society. It looks at how systems of power are expressed and justified in speech acts, at who is left out of the system, and how rhetoric could be either misleading, distorted or oppressive to others. So when we say like rhetoric shapes reality, what if rhetoric shapes reality and distorts it so that I feel like I've used this example before, but like when Bush deceived us that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and a lot of the nation, including Congress, went along with the war in Iraq because of because there was a logical jump from that they had weapons of mass destruction to that intervention was necessary. But if the rhetoric that said Iraq had weapons of mass destruction was fabricated based off of misleading information, then it means that Bush the distorted the reality to make us more likely to go to a war that lasted for like 10 years and was pretty much perceived to be a failure. And if we would have known that there weren't weapons of mass destructions, it could have changed the course of that war. And obviously, there were a lot of people around the world, because NATO got called into that war, and particularly a lot of people in Iraq that ended up being casualties of this rhetoric, essentially, because the connection between 9/11 and Iraq or Saddam Hussein was like completely um, rhetorical. It wasn't real. So the rhetoric distorted reality. So negative criticism negatively criticizes the rhetoric of the powerful or the oppressive. And the rhetoric of Bush in the post 9/11 era is a major topic in rhetorical criticism. And then on the other side, appreciative criticism demonstrates how ordinary people have used rhetoric to assert their own interests and take control of their futures. And by ordinary people here, she just means, for lack of a better word, I think, like people who aren't very powerful. That's what we think of as like not ordinary, saying that they're like not special or not unique, but just ordinary, saying that they aren't, they're the not the people in power. This is kind of like looking at how people resist power. So appreciative criticism appreciatively criticizes the rhetoric of the underdogs or the rhetoric of the resistance. So looking at negative criticism is usually looking at the rhetoric of power, and whereas appreciative criticism is often looking at like the rhetoric of resistance. But it could also be doing an appreciative criticism of people who have power. So if it was doing like an appreciative criticism of a presidential speech and it was appreciating the president's speech, it could still be appreciative. It's just that it tends to be that since appreciative criticism is um it tends to be that appreciative criticism looks at the rhetoric of the underdogs, but appreciative criticism could also appreciate the rhetoric of people who are powerful. So rhetorical critics ask why, not just what or how. And Condit, or sorry, Cloud explains this as the ideology critic doesn't just ask what a message says and how rhetors strategize to overcome obstacles to achieve their ends. So it's not just asking like the four basic components of the rhetoric and what was the message, but it's asking like why this message, why this time, what is it like. If a rhetor is investing the time and energy to make like an argument or to publish or speak a piece of rhetoric, what is their motivation? Whose interests does this rhetoric serve? Why is it being introduced at this time and in this way? Who serves to benefit from this rhetoric? And so the example I give over here is Hitler. Like, you could think with what was the message of Mein Kampf and how did he strategize to overcome obstacles to achieve his ends? Meaning, how did he coalesce people around the Nazi party and get people to join the Nazi party and join his ranks and his project, right? That would be the what and the how. Like, how was he persuasive to his audience? How did he make, like, what, the us, them, or the scapegoat, um, or the construct of an ultimate source of evil. um those are the messages and how he was persuasive. But then also, if you didn't ask why, you would be missing out on understanding this rhetoric, right? So it wasn't just that he was anti-Semitic and these were his beliefs and he was just putting them out there because he wanted to share them. Like, he was using this rhetoric because it had a mobilizing effect. He was using specific rhetorical strategies aimed at the Jewish populations of Europe in order to mobilize people militarily, um, like uh, and organize, World War II. And so the rhetorical critic Kenneth Burke wrote this piece in 1939 called "The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle," which was in 1939, before Hitler rose to, like, on the precipice of World War II, before he took over large parts um, of Eastern Europe. He like, this essay sort of predicted, it did a rhetorical criticism of Hitler's speech in order to predict um and sort of warn society about what was coming with the way that Hitler was mobilizing people against the Jewish population. And so it's rhetorical critics can play a big part in asking why. What is the motive of rhetorical action? Whom does it include and promote? In this case, like the Nazi Party, Germany, and their rise to, try to rise to global hegemony. And then whom does it exclude and demean? In this case, it excluded and demeaned the Jewish population, but also the gay population and some other, the disabled population, and even some of the intellectual population. So the last two slides that I have is covering Marxist and feminist critique and how it could also be negative or appreciative. So with Marxism, Marxists see capitalism as a problem, and that means that they, critics must recognize the role of the economy in our case capitalism, in significantly but not totally determining the dominant ideas of a society organized by that system. So, significantly but not totally means that there's other systems that are shaping dominant ideas. Like if you think about critical race theory, it like not all racism can just be reduced to class or can just be reduced to the economy. Racism came before class and capitalism. So it's not like poverty, for example, cannot be only explained through capitalism because and who poverty influence affects the most, like how it affects racial minorities and gendered minorities the most. That's because of the interplay of capitalism and other systems of power. But that being said, Marxists look at capitalism as having a very significant effect on the way that society is organized and the way that ideas are organized in society. So in the book Manufacturing Consent by Herman and Noam Chomsky, who some of you might have heard of, specifically Noam Chomsky, who's a popular ideology critic. He looks at the way that, like, this book is the subtitle is The Political Economy of Mass Media, but it looks at the way that corporate interests shape mass media. News is like fabricated in order to manufacture consent. So even the name of the title alone like suggests ideology critique because it's like basically how mass media is like how the rhetoric of mass media manufactures the information that makes individuals consent to corporate interests. So, for example, how do like Marxists, if you were doing a negative criticism of how rhetorical critics or how some rhetoric perpetuates domination. For example, if you were looking at, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily be looking at spending itself. You would be looking at these drug advertisements, like the rhetoric of the drug advertisements. But even the diagram suggests that, like, okay, $5.2 billion in spending on prescription drug advertising. Well, the rhetoric of this drug advertisement is, in a sense, manufacturing your consent to use these drugs because the the drug advertisement that says go talk to your doctor and see if this one specific pill is right for you. It wasn't always that case, and in some countries it's illegal. For a lot of countries it's illegal for prescriptions to actually be the one to try to sell themselves and market themselves to you. It's the doctor that has to decide what the pill is right rather than you deciding based on an advertisement what pill is right and then shopping for the doctor that will give it to you, for example. So the drug advertisements in mass media, for example, manufacture consent for wide like swaths of the population to use those drugs, for example. So just the way that advertising can skew reality to make um, certain like people who have money and can advertise their products are going to have their products seen more than people who don't have money and advertise their products. So in that way, like Marxism and like rhetorical ideology critique go like complement each other because when money is involved, oftentimes there's incentive to maintain and enhance and accelerate profit. And so, in the name of accelerating, enhancing profit, rhetoric is distorted in order to get to certain outcomes. And so, the critic looks at the way that the rhetoric distorts the reality in order to shape economic outcomes, in order to shape free market outcomes. So, for example, like companies are motivated to hide the negative health or environmental impacts of their production because they want to sell more. Um, and then also to do appreciative criticism, how does some rhetoric create and mobilize communities by seeking to challenge that domination? So even like the 99%, the idea that Bernie was able to mobilize, I mean, it wasn't a complete success, obviously, because Bernie didn't win either of the presidential nominations, but like he is a person in power that was able to resist, like use a platform and get pretty far of the 99% of those who are, the 99% meaning that we make we're juxtaposed to the 1% who control 99% of the economy, whereas the 99% just have a very small percentage of the economy. So appreciative criticism could look at, for example, how the discourse of the 99% challenges the domination of free market capitalism. And then finally, feminist ideology critique looks at gender relations of power and how they are set up in text. And I thought that this was like obviously Cloud is experienced in feminist ideology critique because of this laundry list of examples that she goes through. So, and these include appreciative and negative critiques. So affirm and celebrate women speakers as role models who break masculine norms of speech and action. And it could even be affirming. It doesn't have to be women, it could be men or non-binary speakers as role models who are feminist, as an appreciative criticism. Or a straight cis man ally, for example, it could even appreciate their rhetoric. It doesn't have to be a women to women to be feminism. And then it could also describe how women, in order to speak, have to adopt feminine style and choice. So that would be more of like the negative criticism, like looking at the way that rhetoric codes certain expectations on women so that if they want to like succeed or be heard, they have to perform a certain way. Or looking at sexist assumptions, metaphors, myths, or stereotypes in mainstream text, especially those performed by men. But again, I would say that there's women who perpetuate anti-feminism. There's women that perpetuate dangerous gender binaries. For example, trans exclusionary radical feminists, for example, are, might have dangerous rhetoric. And then examine how women respond to and use communication in their daily lives. So this could even be like, how do women use rhetoric in instances to fight against domestic abuse, for example, or looking for images of masculinity and femininity to see how when women and men are persuaded into traditional gender roles. So even like the pink aisle and the blue aisle and at Target or Walmart or whatever, like what is the rhetoric of those aisles even saying about what girls should do and what boys should do? Like girls should play with kitchen toys and boys should build stuff, like what is the rhetoric of those that toy playing or those toy advertisements? What is it trying to persuade about what girls are supposed to do versus what boys are supposed to do? And it could celebrate, so again, appreciative instances in which speeches challenge traditional gender roles. So this could be like, for example, looking at the non-binary movement, or looking at how a patriarchal or male-dominated hegemony still remains in society. So how does the patriarchal society resist against the Me Too movement, for example? Like what is their method of counter resistance to the resistance of the Me Too movement? So like I had included a string of cosmopolitan articles down here because that could be, for example, one text of rhetorical criticism, like what would the effects of cosmopolitan ads have on women? Now you could do either negative or appreciative criticism on here. Like you could say that, it's sex positive and sex positive feminism is liberating for women, or you could say it's objectifying and it makes women feel, or tries to persuade women that their traditional role is to please men through sex, and that it sort of also fosters this heteronormativity where when sex is mentioned, like what he thinks during sex, it's always in a reference to a heterosexual form of sex, which cements in that norm that all women should like men and should please men. So those are just some examples. And I feel like feminist also could be like, you could substitute in women for any group of like minorities or underrepresented people. So you could say like, describe how disabled people like use images of ability and disability to see how abled and disabled people are persuaded into roles, or celebrate and describe speech acts which challenge traditional binaries of ability and disability, or explain how racial minorities are role models who break norms of um, racial hierarchization, or act as good role models um, in as allies in the LGBTQ, or in the Black Lives Matter movement, or how, you know, immigrants, in order to speak, must adopt specific rhetorical characteristics in order to be, so like the trope of the model minority, for example. The model minority is conditioned to adopt particular rhetorical styles in order to fit into predominantly white America. But feminist ideology critique, you could do this any type of ideology critique, like um, ableist, or anti-racist ideology critique, or capitalist ideology critique, or even like fascist ideology critique. You could choose a lot of isms and then do a critique of that ideology